Number 1.
Prehistoric rock art, or paintings and carvings on natural, non-portable rock surfaces, appears on every continent of the world. The oldest known example is 45,000 years old and found in Indonesia. North America contains many, albeit much younger, rock art sites. Some of the most celebrated examples occur in the lower Pecos Canyonlands, a roughly 100-mile stretch of land where the Rio Grande and Pecos rivers meet near the Texas-Mexico border. Over 300 cave paintings appear there, some measuring more than 100 feet long. They depict people, animals, and symbols in earth pigments, like red and yellow ochre and charcoal. At up to 4,000 years old, these paintings predate the earliest writing by North Americans. This pictorial repository of prehistoric ritual and myth forms the greatest known resource about the ancient hunter-gatherer people of the Pecos. The first written mention of rock art in the lower Pecos occurred in 1849, and some sites were receiving visitors via passing railroads by the late 19th century. However, concerted efforts to study them did not begin until the early 1930s. In 1931, artist Virginia Carson began recording the images and sketches. Currently, Dr. Carolyn Boyd is the foremost expert on lower Pecos rock art. Originally an artist, Boyd felt so strongly about the murals when she first saw them that she got a doctorate in archaeology to better interpret them. In 1998, Boyd founded the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center, dedicated to studying and preserving the lower Pecos rock art. Scholars have identified 5 different styles of painting in the lower Pecos. The oldest, called Pecos River style, is the most plentiful and elaborate researched. Pecos River style features multicolored anthropomorphs, or abstracted humanoid figures of varying sizes and styles. They have long, thick bodies and short, skinny legs, and often appear with attributes such as headdresses, staffs, or atlatls. The titular white shaman figure at White Shaman Preserve is a perfect example. These colorful and intriguing anthropomorphs probably explain a lot of the general fascination with the Pecos River style. The other styles have received the titles red linear style, sketch-like human and animal forms, red monochrome style, more complex human and animal forms, bold line geometric patterns and small figurative images, and historical period, figurative scenes made after European contact. While the vast majority of lower Pecos rock art consists of paintings, pictographs, a small selection of engraved petroglyphs also appear. The people of the Pecos also had a tradition of portable art in the form of small painted pebbles. Interpreting any sort of prehistoric artworks represents a unique challenge because of how little we know about the cultures that created them. Archaeologists sometimes look to better understood beliefs and customs of Mesoamerican and American Southwest cultures to help explain the Pecos paintings. These so-called ethnological interpretations can be controversial, particularly when comparing cultures widely separated by time. However, they certainly provide some rich and compelling ideas. Some of the imagery has been interpreted as representing Pecos area myth, history, and cosmology. Others have been connected to rituals involving shamanism and hallucinogenic peyote and methyl bean. Evidence of both substances has been found in associated excavations. These theories hold that some of the anthropomorphs may represent shamans, and larger scenes could reflect what these shamans saw in their trances. The connection between geometric shapes like those on many cave walls and altered states of consciousness has previously been established by specialists in European rock art. Images involving snakes and wavy arches seem to connect with how some Native American cultures have envisioned gateways to the spirit world. More specifically, Boyd and other scholars have drawn parallels with the continuing peyote practices of the Huichol peoples. In this interpretation, images of deer with dots on their antlers connect with the Huichol myth of a sacred deer, bringing them peyote. Larger dots with lines through them represent the Huichol's annual peyote hunting ritual. At first, archaeologists assumed that the walls of these caves had acquired artworks piecemeal over time. Therefore, the juxtapositions between figures were assumed to be random. Dr. Boyd has more recently suggested that they are actually unified compositions planned and then executed all at the same time. The discovery of underdrawings that laid out compositions before the application of paint helps to support her theory. Modern culture may have conditioned us to think of imagery on cave walls as some kind of casual graffiti, but that's clearly not the case here. Lower Pecos rock art has lasted for thousands of years, thanks to the very dry local climate. Unfortunately, it may not survive for much longer due to a combination of human and environmental threats. An endeavor called the Alexandria Project is attempting to protect them. Part of the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center, the Alexandria Project does not aim to physically preserve the Lower Pecos rock art. Instead, archaeologists use high-tech methods to capture every aspect of the murals, creating records that will endure, even if the originals fall prey to rising water levels, vandalism, or something else. It's a daunting effort, especially because additional sites continue to be discovered. Due to drug-related violence on the Mexican side of the Lower Pecos, the Alexandria Project is currently only able to work on sites in Texas. In the Lower Pecos, most rock art sites occur on privately owned lands. While many landowners have cooperated with the Alexandria Project and its efforts, they do not open their sites to the public. However, several caves are accessible to interested viewers. For example, the Witt Museum now owns and conducts tours of the White Shaman Preserve. The museum has long been involved in the excavation and scientific study of the Lower Pecos. It owns many artifacts from the region and has galleries dedicated to the people of the Pecos. In Seminole Canyon State Park, an historic site, visitors can enjoy tours of the Fate Bell and Fate Bell Annex rock art sites. Meanwhile, Parita Cave and Panther Cave, two more famed sites, are available in the Amistad National Recreation Area. Despite not being nearly as old or well-known as caves like Lascaux and Chauvet, Lower Pecos rock art represents a fascinating look into the lives of ancient North Americans. It deserves to be much better celebrated than it has been up until this point.
Number 2.
6 miles from Urfa, an ancient city in southeastern Turkey, Klaus Schmidt has made one of the most startling archaeological discoveries of our time: massive carved stones about 11,000 years old, crafted and arranged by prehistoric people who had not yet developed metal tools or even pottery. The megaliths predate Stonehenge by some 6,000 years. The place is called Göbekli Tepe, and Schmidt, a German archaeologist who has been working here more than a decade, is convinced it's the site of the world's oldest temple. Guten Morgen, he says at 5:20 a.m., when his van picks me up at my hotel in Urfa. 30 minutes later, the van reaches the foot of a grassy hill and parks next to strands of barbed wire. We follow a knot of workmen up the hill to rectangular pits shaded by a corrugated steel roof, the main excavation site. In the pits, standing stones, or pillars, are arranged in circles. Beyond, on the hillside, are 4 other rings of partially excavated pillars. Each ring has a roughly similar layout. In the center are 2 large stone T-shaped pillars encircled by slightly smaller stones facing inward. The tallest pillars tower 16 feet and, Schmidt says, weigh between 7 and 10 tons. As we walk among them, I see that some are blank, while others are elaborately carved. Foxes, lions, scorpions and vultures abound, twisting and crawling on the pillars' broad sides. Schmidt points to the great stone rings, one of them 65 feet across. This is the first human-built holy place, he says. From this perch 1,000 feet above the valley, we can see to the horizon in nearly every direction. Schmidt, 53, asks me to imagine what the landscape would have looked like 11,000 years ago, before centuries of intensive farming and settlement turned it into the nearly featureless brown expanse it is today. Prehistoric people would have gazed upon herds of gazelle and other wild animals, gently flowing rivers, which attracted migrating geese and ducks, fruit and nut trees, and rippling fields of wild barley, and wild wheat varieties such as emmer and einkorn. This area was like a paradise, says Schmidt, a member of the German Archaeological Institute. Indeed, Göbekli Tepe sits at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, an arc of mild climate and arable land from the Persian Gulf to present-day Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, and would have attracted hunter-gatherers from Africa and the Levant. And partly because Schmidt has found no evidence that people permanently resided on the summit of Göbekli Tepe itself, he believes this was a place of worship on an unprecedented scale, humanity's first cathedral on a hill. With the sun higher in the sky, Schmidt ties a white scarf around his balding head, turban style, and deftly picks his way down the hill among the relics. In rapid-fire German he explains that he has mapped the entire summit using ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys, charting where at least 16 other megalith rings remain buried across 22 acres. The 1-acre excavation covers less than 5% of the site. He says archaeologists could dig here for another 50 years and barely scratch the surface. Göbekli Tepe was first examined and dismissed by University of Chicago and Istanbul University anthropologists in the 1960s. As part of a sweeping survey of the region, they visited the hill, saw some broken slabs of limestone, and assumed the mound was nothing more than an abandoned medieval cemetery. In 1994, Schmidt was working on his own survey of prehistoric sites in the region. After reading a brief mention of the stone-littered hilltop in the University of Chicago researchers' report, he decided to go there himself. From the moment he first saw it, he knew the place was extraordinary. Unlike the stark plateaus nearby, Göbekli Tepe, the name means belly hill in Turkish, has a gently rounded top that rises 50 feet above the surrounding landscape. To Schmidt's eye, the shape stood out. Only man could have created something like this, he says. It was clear right away this was a gigantic Stone Age site. The broken pieces of limestone that earlier surveyors had mistaken for gravestones suddenly took on a different meaning. Schmidt returned a year later with 5 colleagues, and they uncovered the first megaliths, a few buried so close to the surface they were scarred by plows. As the archaeologists dug deeper, they unearthed pillars arranged in circles. Schmidt's team, however, found none of the telltale signs of a settlement. No cooking hearths, houses or trash pits, and none of the clay fertility figurines that litter nearby sites of about the same age. The archaeologists did find evidence of tool use, including stone hammers and blades. And because those artifacts closely resemble others from nearby sites previously carbon dated to about 9000 BC, Schmidt and co-workers estimate that Göbekli Tepe stone structures are the same age. Limited carbon dating undertaken by Schmidt at the site confirms this assessment. The way Schmidt sees it, Göbekli Tepe's sloping rocky ground is a stonecutter's dream. Even without metal chisels or hammers, prehistoric masons wielding flint tools could have chipped away at softer limestone outcrops, shaping them into pillars on the spot, before carrying them a few hundred yards to the summit and lifting them upright. Then, Schmidt says, once the stone rings were finished, the ancient builders covered them over with dirt. Eventually, they placed another ring nearby or on top of the old one. Over centuries, these layers created the hilltop. Today, Schmidt oversees a team of more than a dozen German archaeologists, 50 local laborers, and a steady stream of enthusiastic students. He typically excavates at the site for 2 months in the spring and 2 in the fall. Summer temperatures reach 115 degrees, too hot to dig. In the winter the area is deluged by rain. In 1995, he bought a traditional Ottoman house with a courtyard in Urfa, a city of nearly 500,000 people, to use as a base of operations. On the day I visit, a bespectacled Belgian man sits at one end of a long table in front of a pile of bones. Joris Peters, an archaeologist from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, specializes in the analysis of animal remains. Since 1998, he has examined more than 100,000 bone fragments from Göbekli Tepe. Peters has often found cut marks and splintered edges on them, signs that the animals from which they came were butchered and cooked. The bones, stored in dozens of plastic crates stacked in a storeroom at the house, are the best clue to how people who created Göbekli Tepe lived. Peters has identified tens of thousands of gazelle bones, which make up more than 60% of the total, plus those of other wild game such as boar, sheep and red deer. He's also found bones of a dozen different bird species, including vultures, cranes, ducks and geese. The first year, we went through 15,000 pieces of animal bone, all of them wild. It was pretty clear we were dealing with a hunter-gatherer site, Peters says. It's been the same every year since. The abundant remnants of wild game indicate that the people who lived here had not yet domesticated animals or farmed. But, Peters and Schmidt say, Göbekli Tepe's builders were on the verge of a major change in how they lived, thanks to an environment that held the raw materials for farming. They had wild sheep, wild grains that could be domesticated, and the people with the potential to do it, Schmidt says. In fact, research at other sites in the region has shown that within 1,000 years of Göbekli Tepe's construction, settlers had corralled sheep, cattle, and pigs. And, at a prehistoric village just 20 miles away, geneticists found evidence of the world's oldest domesticated strains of wheat. Radiocarbon dating indicates agriculture developed there around 10,500 years ago, or just 5 centuries after Göbekli Tepe's construction. To Schmidt and others, these new findings suggest a novel theory of civilization. Scholars have long believed that only after people learn to farm and live in settled communities did they have the time, organization, and resources to construct temples and support complicated social structures. But Schmidt argues it was the other way around. The extensive coordinated effort to build the monoliths literally laid the groundwork for the development of complex societies. The immensity of the undertaking at Göbekli Tepe reinforces that view. Schmidt says the monuments could not have been built by ragged bands of hunter-gatherers. To carve, erect, and bury rings of 7-ton stone pillars would have required hundreds of workers, all needing to be fed and housed. Hence the eventual emergence of settled communities in the area around 10,000 years ago. This shows socio-cultural changes come first, agriculture comes later, says Stanford University archaeologist Ian Hodder, who excavated Çatalhöyük, a prehistoric settlement 300 miles from Göbekli Tepe. You can make a good case this area is the real origin of complex Neolithic societies. What was so important to these early people that they gathered to build and bury the stone rings? The gulf that separates us from Göbekli Tepe's builders is almost unimaginable. Indeed, though I stood among the looming megaliths eager to take in their meaning, they didn't speak to me. They were utterly foreign, placed there by people who saw the world in a way I will never comprehend. There are no sources to explain what the symbols might mean. Schmidt agrees. We're 6,000 years before the invention of writing here, he says. There's more time between Göbekli Tepe and the Sumerian clay tablets etched in 3300 BC than from Sumer to today, says Gary Rolfson, an archaeologist at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, who is familiar with Schmidt's work. Trying to pick out symbolism from prehistoric context is an exercise in futility. Still, archaeologists have their theories, evidence, perhaps, of the irresistible human urge to explain the unexplainable. The surprising lack of evidence that people lived right there, researchers say, argues against its use as a settlement or even a place where, for instance, clan leaders gathered. Hodder is fascinated that Göbekli Tepe's pillar carvings are dominated not by edible prey like deer and cattle, but by menacing creatures such as lions, spiders, snakes, and scorpions. It's a scary, fantastic world of nasty-looking beasts, he muses. While later cultures were more concerned with farming and fertility, he suggests, perhaps these hunters were trying to master their fears by building this complex, which is a good distance from where they lived. Danielle Stordeur, an archaeologist at the National Center for Scientific Research in France, emphasizes the significance of the vulture carvings. Some cultures have long believed the high-flying carrion birds transported the flesh of the dead up to the heavens. Stordeur has found similar symbols at sites from the same era as Göbekli Tepe, just 50 miles away in Syria. You can really see it's the same culture, she says. All the most important symbols are the same. For his part, Schmidt is certain the secret is right beneath his feet. Over the years, his team has found fragments of human bone in the layers of dirt that filled the complex. Deep test pits have shown that the floors of the rings are made of hardened limestone. Schmidt is betting that beneath the floors you'll find the structure's true purpose, a final resting place for a society of hunters. Perhaps, Schmidt says, the site was a burial ground or the center of a death cult, the dead laid out on the hillside among the stylized gods and spirits of the afterlife. If so, Göbekli Tepe's location was no accident. From here the dead are looking out at the ideal view, Schmidt says, as the sun casts long shadows over the half-buried pillars. They're looking out over a hunter's dream.
Number 3.
Archaeologists are rarely stumped when it comes to figuring out the purpose of the Roman artifacts they unearth. However, the Roman dodecahedron has everyone baffled. Over 100 of these hollow, knobby, metallic polyhedrons with 12 sides have surfaced at excavation sites mostly around Central Europe. At present, there is no definitive answer to their function or purpose. The enigmatic geometric forms consist of copper alloy. They range in size from 4 centimeters to 11 centimeters, and each of the 12 pentagonal faces contains a circular hole. Oddly, the diameters of the holes are not identical in a single dodecahedron. They also vary from one dodecahedron to another. All of the Roman dodecahedra have 5 globular knobs at the vertices of the pentagonal faces. The variations in dimensions and designs of the dodecahedra, in addition to their holes, are perplexing. Some dodecahedra surfaced in the antiquities market and, therefore, lack archaeological context. Others emerged in controlled scientific excavations. Archaeologists unearthed the southernmost Roman dodecahedron at Arles in France. The northwesternmost example comes from a site on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. Yet another piece comes from Bordeaux. Additionally, they have also surfaced as far east as Vienna and Zagreb. There is a distinct lack of consistency in the archaeological context of the cast dodecahedra. Roman military camps, public baths, and temples have contained samples. Dodecahedra surfaced in a Roman theater, a tomb, and a well that contained numerous discarded items. Several also turned up in coin hoards, suggesting that they were valued objects. Even an analysis of the layers of dirt around excavation sites from the 2nd to the 4th century CE provides no clues. As a result, these variations in the discoveries have confounded those attempting to clarify their function. Additionally, a complete absence of any mention of them in Roman texts adds to their mystery. From the first report of a dodecahedron in 1739 until today, over 200 archaeologists, historians, mathematicians, and hobbyists have put forth theories on the purpose of these bizarre objects. Dodecahedra, for the most part, originate in Gallo-Roman lands where Roman culture overlaid an indigenous ancient Celtic civilization. Therefore, several theories involve mysticism. Some propose that the dodecahedra had a religious function with the 12 holes symbolizing cosmic phenomena. Others suggest that they had a talismanic role. However, since they are too large to suspend from the neck, perhaps they dangled from a belt. Alternatively, they could have fit nicely into a leather purse. A more likely supposition is that they serve some function in astronomical calculations. Perhaps they sat on a flat surface or leaned on a stick. According to this hypothesis, a dodecahedron could align with the sun, which would shine through 2 holes at a specific time of day in a particular season. The proponents of this theory used complicated mathematical calculations to show that a dodecahedron could predict astronomical events. In his article, The Hypothesis, G.M.C. Wagemans used a series of estimates showing that several dodecahedra could calculate the best winter grain in specific locations in northern Europe. Some skeptics refute the mathematical astronomical theories. They conclude that the differences in hole sizes and the overall size of Roman dodecahedra prove that they cannot have been used to calculate astronomical phenomena. The same goes for the theory that the metal dodecahedron served as a modern-day theodolite for measuring distances required in land surveying. Other theorists have advanced more straightforward ideas concerning the function of the Roman dodecahedron. Some have said it was useful for soothsaying or divination, where seers toss the metal object and read it like a die. However, the fact that the sides bear no written inscriptions or symbols militates against this purpose. Rolling or tossing a Roman dodecahedron would have been almost impossible because of the protruding knobs. Therefore, it is unlikely to have been a divination tool or an object used in a game. Candlestick holder? Because traces of wax exist in some dodecahedra, researchers have proposed that they were candle holders. However, many experts have dismissed this notion for 2 reasons. First, the wax residue is probably a remnant of the lost wax process used in casting. Second, if these items were candlestick holders, why haven't archaeologists found a single example in Italy or regions of the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean? The distinct geographical area of dodecahedra discoveries makes the mysterious items unique within the vast world of Roman archaeology. In contrast, other types and models of bronze castings are ubiquitous throughout the empire. Knitter? Among the theories that hobbyists have proposed, the most ingenious involves the use of a dodecahedron to crochet or knit a wool glove. A talented student recently made a Roman dodecahedron 3D print of one and worked a glove on it. Subsequently, the student recorded the process and adopted the idea of making a winter hand covering on a Roman dodecahedron. Fits nicely with the wintry geographical discovery sites. Additionally, maybe the different sizes of the holes on the faces correspond to various fingers on a glove. Decoration? Perhaps the Roman dodecahedron served as nothing other than decoration. One could imagine that the odd piece suspended from a rope on a belt may have added a bit of swagger to a costume. Similar polyhedral decorative beads with globular protrusions surfaced in sites dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries BCE in Southeast Asia. However, the idea that Roman dodecahedra were merely decorative does not take into account the inconsistent sizes of the circular holes. Will anyone ever solve the puzzle of the function of the Roman dodecahedron? Judging from the many theories over the last 200 years, the solution to the enigma may prove to be elusive.
Number 4.
Imagine yourself on a yacht, sailing down the coast of South America, stopping along the various Peruvian coastal towns. One morning, as you are about to head in toward Paracas and the harbor of Pisco, you spy upon the coast what appears to be a giant candlestick, pitchfork, or trident, pointing inland. As you draw closer to land, you realize that this huge figure has been etched into the sands of a sloping hill above the rocks on the coastline. You have found the Paracas candelabra, or the candelabra of the Andes. The candelabra has been recorded as being around 600 feet from tip to base, dependent upon the section measured. In appearance, it is a large central line from which two arms branch out to form an overlying U shape. At the top of the main, or middle, line there are smaller lines resembling antlers or candle holders that reach from either side of the main line. These additions also appear on both of the outer arms as well. Overall, the figure has the appearance of a giant candlestick. In addition to the main lines of the candelabra, there is also a second set of tracks from the main lines sent out to support the large branching arms. Another interesting feature is the lower set of lines looping the sides of the branching arms. They almost look like a person with a bizarre hat and their hands on their hips. This has led the way to descriptions of the figure as that of a large alien-like persona with arms upraised and fingers extended. The candelabra was literally etched into the earth. The rock base of the sandy cliff that the candelabra sits on is not hard and is easily chipped. Due to the softness of the rock, the lines of the gigantic drawing are up to 3 feet in depth. This depth has prevented the lines from being covered completely and allowed it to survive to puzzle us up to the present day. Visible from as far as 12 miles out to sea, the famous figure has provoked many arguments in the scientific community. Very little is known of the origins of the mysterious landmark. Pottery found near the candelabra has been dated at 200 BC and is assignable to the Paracas culture. Yet, the candelabra bears no similarity to Paracas artifacts found locally or to those attributed to the Ica, Nazca, or Huari cultures. If none of these societies, all of whom populated the land surrounding the candelabra, are the people who made the figure, then who did, and for what possible reason would they create this enormous carving? The candelabra greatly resembles the famous lines of the Glastonbury Zodiac and the Nazca lines, the latter just 130 miles away from the candelabra. Due to these similarities, many have proposed that the candelabra serves as a sort of celestial chart, or an enormous road sign, pointing directly toward the Nazca lines. The latter idea fits handily in with a popular theory, dismissed by most scientists, that the Nazca Desert lines are a type of runway for spacecraft. This theory was first presented in the late 1960s and early 1970s by noted scholar Eric von Daniken in his book, Chariots of the Gods. Seeming to support this is an ancient Peruvian legend, which survives to this day, about the goddess Orellana, or Orellana, landing in a great ship from the sky. But if this were the case, why the placement of the candelabra in so obvious of a position is best to be seen by sailors, not space people? Charles Berlitz, in his book, Mysteries from Forgotten Worlds, states that the Spanish conquistadors noticed the candelabra and took it as a sign from heaven, the Holy Trinity, interpreting it as a good omen, which encouraged their quest to conquer and Christianize the locals. Upon examining the carving, the Spaniards discovered a huge rope attached to the central fork, and indications that other cords and ropes, connected to the other outer two arms, comprised an apparatus of unknown use. Various theories have arisen from these findings, and all seem to point toward a crude pulley system. Some scientists favor the theory that the candelabra may have been a tidal calculator for sailors, although no one is quite sure how it would have operated. Beltran Garcia, a Peruvian commentator, thinks that the candelabra may have been more than a tidal calculator, that this system, equipped with counterweights, graded ladders and ropes sliding on pulleys, constituted a gigantic and precise seismograph, able to register telluric waves and seismic shocks, coming not only from Peru, but from all over the planet. While a seismograph seems a bit far-fetched, there is a certain ring of truth and clues pointing towards its uses by the sailing community, especially since the early Peruvians were noted for their seamanship. Toni Morrison, a celebrated writer, researcher, and photographer who has documented the Nazca Lines for the BBC and in books, has delved into the mystery of the candelabra as well. He found that the overall consensus of local folklore pegged the candelabra as a landmark made by early sailors, with no serious evidence pointing toward any other motivation for building it. This information was verified through talks with a local Englishman, Duncan Masson, who had lived on a farm in Ica, some 130 miles south of the candelabra, most of his life. Duncan heard first-hand accounts about the candelabra from people who were born in the early 19th century. In addition, Mr. Morrison notes that the Paracas coastline, which includes Pisco Bay, has been a stopping point and layover for sailors for centuries, starting with the Spanish in the 16th century. He points out that these early sailors would have had many inactive months to complete the carving, and that the symbolism of its three branches seems European, examples being the three-armed tree of life and the Holy Trinity. Perhaps it is a giant tidal calculator, a seismograph, or a landmark for sailors to return to, or maybe the candelabra served as a sort of anchor for a pulley system that enabled the Peruvians to haul large rock pieces from the cliffs below into the mountains for use in their monolithic stone architecture. Perhaps the answer is some combination of these theories. We may well solve the riddle of the candelabra by figuring out the answers to the other historical mysteries and controversies of Peru. It is a land of many unanswered questions. There are many indications that Peruvians possessed technology that, as far as scientific findings have shown, they should not have possessed. How, for example, without the aid of electricity, did the ancient Peruvians plate precious metals? How did they successfully perform brain surgery by taking out sections of the skull and replacing them with gold or copper plates, lacking modern medical knowledge or instruments? We may never know the real answer to the question of why a group of people etched the particular candlestick-like figure into a hill by the ocean. We can, however, choose to visit and explore the strange place for ourselves to see if we ourselves might uncover a clue to the mysterious candelabra of Paracas.
Number 5.
It's almost 10 a.m., and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts curator of ancient art is making introductions. This is Hapi. He's the god of fertility, and has an offering in his hand. I like to think of it as him offering our visitors a chance to visit ancient Egypt. Weighing in at 5.6 tons and standing 17 feet tall, Hapi is an imposing figure, one of more than 200 ancient artifacts discovered at the bottom of Abouker Bay. These artifacts, the result of the European Institute of Underwater Archaeology's excavation led by French archaeologist Frank Goddio, have been on a global tour, making stops in France, Great Britain, Switzerland, and, most recently, California. This will be the exhibition's last stop in the U.S. As we make our way down into the gallery, it's cool and dark. Immediately cueing thoughts of underwater shirts explains that Treasures of Ancient Egypt, Sunken Cities is divided thematically into time, place, belief, and practice. The timeline puts us smack dab in the middle of the late period, the 7th to 4th centuries BC, and the Ptolemaic dynasty, 305–31 BC. For us history laymen, that's about 2,000 years after the building of the pyramids and 2,000 years before today. It's a time of great change, as Egyptian and Grecian civilizations merged socially and politically. One of the first salient objects we come upon in the gallery is a granite Iorite statue depicting a queen dressed as the Egyptian god Isis. This is a fascinating period, and one of the most fascinating aspects is how artistic conventions of Greece and Egypt are combined. Shirt says, "Our unnamed queen is standing in the stiff traditional pose of Egyptians, symbolizing stability eternal. Her hands grasp at her side, her left foot is set slightly in front of her right. She gazes straight ahead, steady and certain. But her hairstyle is Greek." When Goddio went in search of these artifacts 2 decades ago, he believed he was going to discover 3 ancient port cities off Egypt's north coast, all of which had pretty much disappeared from the historical record. Instead, he found only two, Thonis Heracleon and Canopus. Thonis is the Egyptian name, and Heracleon is the Greek name. Schurz says. I tell people he had his workload cut by 1/3. These once sunken objects are in incredible condition, a result of the Nile Delta and its proclivity for creating unstable land masses. All that soil and silt that flow in the river means there is so much dirt, so when things fall into the water, they get covered up quickly. Schurz says. They're preserved in an anaerobic environment, so no critters. The gold coins and jewelry and gilded statuettes are both lovely and important. They're indicative of a very global cosmopolitan market. As we move through the gallery, from place to belief, Schurz explains how many of these encased objects were found in temples, which means Persians and Greeks and other Mediterranean sojourners would pay homage to local Egyptian gods, leaving offerings at these sacred places. These are from the wealthy island of Cyprus. Schurz says, pointing to a few finely detailed shiny gold coins that were discovered among the remains of an Egyptian temple. But the gold has been tested and it comes from Egypt. We estimate tons and tons of gold was being exported from Egypt to the rest of the Mediterranean, then coming back to Egypt. The Egyptian belief system, as most religious structures are, was the indelible foundation for most of daily life. Gods were created and celebrated, worshipped and feared. One god, though, was especially revered by Thonis Heracleon and Canopus denizens during this time. A significant portion of the exhibition is dedicated to Osiris, the Egyptian god of fertility and the afterlife. After Osiris's jealous brother, Seth, cuts him into 14 pieces and scatters his remains across the world, Osiris's wife and sister, Isis, journeys to find them. She gathers his broken body and wraps it in linens, the mythological source of the first mummy. Isis becomes a bird of prey and beats life back into his body. Osiris impregnates her, then recedes into the Egyptian netherworld. Each year, the Mysteries of Osiris festival celebrated this rebirth. Thousands and thousands of people would line the banks of the Nile as a maritime procession carried Osiris images down the river. These images were made with silk from the Nile and barley seeds, forming a mummy of the god, which was then put into gold molds. The images were watered with the sacred water of the river. If the seed sprouted, that would be a harbinger of a good crop year. Because he is restored to life, Osiris becomes associated with fertility and regeneration. Schurz says. Egyptians see cycles everywhere in the Egyptian mind. It's the paradigm of the universe. The sun rises and gives us light, then day dies and turns to night. The Nile floods every year and deposits soil, crops grow, you harvest them, the land goes fallow. And night and day starts all over again.